Bé, bona nit a tothom. Moltes gràcies per venir, perquè entenc que és un divendres prefestes de Nadal i moltíssima gent ha marxat i moltíssima gent està allà celebrant el Nadal. Llavors entenc que l'esforç que heu fet per venir aquí és molt gran i us ho agraïm moltíssim, sobretot a la gent jove, que un divendres a la nit estigueu aquí és sorprenent i res, des del Ministeri us agraïm molt que estigueu aquí. Jo només us volia presentar a les dues persones que tenim avui, que venen degut al projecte que tenim, que és la residència Faber, que és una residència de Ciències i Humanitats que tenim a la Massana, i a la qual venen especialistes de tot el món a treballar en els seus projectes i a canvi ens donen regalets com aquests que ens donaran aquesta nit Paul Behrens. L'Alan Ward és professor de l'Escola Andorrana de Batxillerat i també és el cap de les noves tecnologies de la SAC, de la Societat de Ciències Andorranes. Serà qui una mica dirigirà la sessió i ara us explicarà com funcionarà tot. Moltes gràcies de nou.
Moltes gràcies. Primer presentaré una mica el doctor Paul aquí present. Després us explicaré una mica com farem la sessió, perquè ningú es perdi. Serà una sessió curta, amena, però en anglès. Tranquils, no passa res. Els meus alumnes del dilluns a l'escola se van sortir molt bé, van sobreviure, encara estan vius, i vostès també, d'aquí una hora encara estareu resultant. Cap problema. El doctor Paul és d'origen anglès, bàsicament és físic, és investigador física, ha participat en diferents projectes, un projecte interessant, per exemple, a les Illes Canàries, per utilitzar un tema de làsers que jo tampoc he entès, però igual li preguntarem. Ha estat molt també en el tema de canvi climàtic, amb el seu doctorat, també a la Baixa Nova Zelanda, dic a baix, a l'altre costat del món. Déu-n'hi-do la feina que ha fet allà, ha estat un locutor de la ràdio d'allà, ha estat sempre en una tasca divulgativa d'explicació. O sigui, dit molt senzillament, és un professor que li agrada ser professor. Crec que ho dic bé. Jo ja ho diré després. El que ens concerneix avui està aquí, entre altres coses, perquè està treballant sobre un llibre seu, un llibre de divulgació, d'explicació, que va amb aquest títol, The Best of Times, The Worst of Times. Interessant aquest títol, O sigui, traduït ràpidament, vivim temps bons, però a la vegada també temps una mica perillosos, no? Hope and despair in the environmental crisis, o sigui, esperança i desesperança en un temps de crisi del medi ambient. Llavors, sense estar més, el que farem és que t'he preparat una presentació aquí, calculem uns 20 minuts, potser una miqueta més, parlarà molt lentament, diu, molt didàctic. Després, tranquil·lament, si hi ha coses que voleu precisar, que contestem, que intenti precisar una mica més, pregunteu en la llengua que us sembli una mica millor, menys el xinès, perquè llavors pensem que posareu a mi amb apuros, però català, castellà, entén més del que vol admetre. Si parleu lentament nosaltres. I sense més preàmbuls, crec que podem donar una mica el tret de sortida i Dr. Paul, com vulgui. It's all yours.
Okay, thank you very much for coming out tonight. Can everybody hear me? I prefer to speak just normally, but if it's not loud enough, then... Can everybody hear at the back? There's some thumbs? Okay, great. It's okay. I'm used to lecturing in the big halls. Does it need it for the... Well, thank you very much for coming out tonight. I'm going to talk a little bit about my research, a little bit about the book that I've been working on, a little bit about our environmental future. And it obviously affects us all. I find it some of the most fascinating things that we can be looking at today. So, my book is called The Best of Times, The Worst of Times. And the reason is because I want to look at both the negative sides of the environmental crisis, just how deep a problem we face, and the solutions that might be available to us, and the things that we can do, both in society and in technology, because we can't do it without doing both of them at the same time, as we'll see tonight. So my area of research is an area called industrial ecology. It's a bit small, but industrial ecology. So industrial ecology is a systems-based science, where you look at how all the different parts of the environment and society fit together. So can we change the ways in which we consume? Can we change the ways in which we produce things? What are the different ways we can do that best within the global system that we now currently live in? My own area of research is on very large economic models, which trace how different products are made in one place and then consumed in another place. So, for example, if we think about Brazilian beef being grown near or what once was the Amazon and then being exported elsewhere to Europe, for example. And that's the kind of work that I do in my research days. If you think about the different perspectives we use, we think about sustainability, we think about the environment, economy, technology, these sorts of things. And some of the areas of industrial ecology are circular economy. Maybe you've heard of a circular economy. This is the idea of taking wastes and bringing it back into the economy. That's an industrial ecology idea. We also do footprinting. So when you hear online and you hear things about how we use 1.5 Earths per person, then that's a footprinting exercise. And we also look at things like the Sustainable Development Goals. So we look at how income changes our impacts. My personal focus is on the connections between climate, food, energy, water, these sorts of things. So, why was I interested in this particular topic? I looked at my bookshelf and I looked at the books which are for popular reading by the public. And they basically fall into two camps, two parts. One, very optimistic. It's amazing. Artificial intelligence, technologies are incredible. Look at humans, our boundless creativity. We are incredible. We'll be fine. And the other side, it's all pretty bad. It's all pretty gloomy. We're going for collapse. We're going for catastrophe. It's going to be that way. We're not going to be able to change. And so you've got these two very distinct areas in the literature. And one day I climbed on my desk and I took a picture. I almost fell off. And I took a picture of a few of the books on the different sides here. So from the very optimistic Steven Pinker, some of you might have read Steven Pinker, Enlightenment Now, things like Factfulness. The world is just getting a better place. You don't need to worry. It's all good. It's reassuring. All the way through to some things sort of in the middle, but not very many books in the middle. And then the really negative stuff. The vanishing face of the earth, limits to growth, dangerous years, reason in a dark time. You know, all of this really, really negative books. A lot of those books tend to have lots of negativity, and then at the end, a little bit of hope. You know, just so that by the end of the book you go, oh, okay, there's things we can do. Oh, I was sweating a lot, but now I'm fine. But I wanted to take this and make them separate in the book, like really commit to both perspectives and have a look. So, some of the important concepts in the book I want to describe tonight because I think they're very important for all of us. Some things might be difficult to explain in English, so we can always answer questions. But I think they're really crucial things that we all need to understand about the way systems work. Because individually, we've been trained as humans in education to think in a somewhat linear way. We think of problems as this is the problem, this is the solution and the problem. But we live in a very complicated world. A lot of us want to make a difference, yet we have no idea how to do it. I go into a supermarket and I research this stuff and I look at the food in front of me and I have no idea which ones, other than don't eat the meat. I struggle to know exactly which ones are the best choices. for all of the environmental impacts. So understanding how some of these things fit together is very important. So, some of the things we need to consider. The Great Acceleration. This is the period more recently in human societies where we've seen everything go in this exponential curve, so non-linear way. So population, GDP, urban population, energy use, water use, large dams. This is the social side of the ledger, of the account. On the natural side of the account, carbon dioxide, surface temperature, ocean acidification, biosphere degradation, tropical forest loss, and domesticated land. And these have the same sorts of trajectories, the same sorts of lines. Now, at a certain point, we're going to expand to the point in which we cover absolutely all of the planet, and we degrade all of the things that we require in order to live. This is quite remarkable. It's maybe a little bit of a straightforward plot, but I think it's quite interesting. This is the global ice-free land surface. So this is the surface of the land, of the Earth, that's not covered by ice, so not the ice caps. This is from the recent biodiversity report, IBPES. You can see the different types of land use. The infrastructure, the cropland, the pasture, the plantation forests, and at the end we have unforested ecosystems with minimal human use, forests which are intact and other minimal use, and other land. And so we've got a picture where about 75%, 72% of the entire surface of the Earth that's not covered by ice, this entire land, is used by humans in some way, which is astonishing to me. I mean, maybe you just take a look at the picture of the Earth at night and you can see the lights over the Earth at night, and maybe that doesn't come as a surprise, but that always comes as a surprise to me. One picture here is even if we didn't have the issues of climate change and biodiversity, we still got these issues with pasture lands. Pasture lands for animals make up about 20% of all the land use that we use. So even if we didn't have all the other problems, we'd still have an issue with animal agriculture in the amount of land that we use for animal agriculture. This is the planetary boundaries. Have some people have seen the planetary boundaries, perhaps? Anybody? The planetary boundaries basically describe where we are in all the different impacts of the different areas of the planet environmentally. If we have a look at the centre here and moving outwards, each of the different problems are on the outside. Here, below this line, this circle here, below this circle, so for example, freshwater use and ozone depletion is safe. We don't think that we've passed tipping points. We don't think that we have passed thresholds to change the planet irreversibly. Between this circle and this circle, we're not sure. We could be, we could not be, we don't know. The science is difficult to tell whether we will have stepped over the point of no return with some irreversible changes. So if we look at the things that we are definitely over, are phosphorus and nitrogen flows, genetic biodiversity. We're currently in the 6th extinction event that we've seen over time. So we've seen 5 extinction events over this over history, and we are currently in the 6th extinction event now. And the phosphorus and nitrogen flows, these are the flows that we need for fertilizers. These are what we need to grow food. And you can see why we need a lot of food, and so we have the cycles out of balance. There is a couple that we don't know yet how far we have gone. Land system change and climate change. It's difficult to know right now whether we have gone over irreversible tipping points and how fast we can step back. But I will talk more about that in a moment. So some important concepts. We've already seen how all of those curves are going up in exponential curves. Things speed up, but so does technology speed up over time. So here, this is 1900, And this is the telephone, and this is the adoption rate. This is how many people, as a percentage, have the telephone. And we can see the angle of the line, the gradient of the line here is quite slow. But as we move more and more to the present, that gradient of the line gets steeper and steeper and steeper, meaning that more and more people are buying things more and more quickly, and more innovation is coming from it. So you've got this point of this acceleration where now, if we make one mistake, say, and we plan on something being very fast, and it's not, then we're sunk. Because we are betting that we'll be able to do something that we aren't able to do. I'll talk about that in a moment, but the thing at the moment is bringing carbon out of the atmosphere. So we think that we've probably overextended, we've put too much carbon in the atmosphere already, and we're going to take some of that carbon out of the atmosphere, and it's going to be very difficult. And we assume that it's going to be very fast, that we're going to do it very quickly. I'll talk more about that in a moment. The one important thing here is, as each time that we innovate, so each time that we make something new, so each time we make artificial fertilizer, for example, we create more problems in the future. So artificial fertilizer allowed us to feed billions of people, billions more people, in fact right now 7.8 billion people on the planet, but it gives us a whole bunch of other problems that we have to deal with. Algal blooms, biodiversity loss, nitrogen and phosphorus flows out of sink, and also depletion of those resources. So we've fixed one thing, and then we have another problem. This is the idea of a progress trap, where we make progress, but we have a problem because we've made that progress. And what do we see when we see certain progress traps? Is we see collapse. We see situations where we've created too much of a problem that society can cope with. And the question then is, how does society adapt to the problems that they face? A really classical example is ancient Sumer, which is the ancient Sumerians in the Middle East. And they were some of the first people to develop irrigation and agriculture. But they didn't realise that the soils weren't draining very well. So the soils weren't taking the water away very well, and you had salt accumulating in the soils. And eventually, everything was infertile. And so they didn't realise until too late. They tried to change to barley instead of wheat, instead of trigo, in order to try and adapt, because barley is more salt tolerant, but there wasn't enough calories to keep society going. And we can see the different collapses of different empires over time. The question is, are we going the same way? How is it different today, and what can we do about it to change? It's very different in that we have a globalized society, so that's very, very different. In each of these cases, it wasn't the case necessarily that all the people of that civilization died. They just moved on to different civilizations. So you had the West Rome and Eastern Rome moved into the Byzantine Empire, and they became something else. But in every case, everything becomes less complex. So in the UK, for example, in England, after the collapse of Rome, they forgot how to make nails for 500 years. The technologies that the Romans had given the people of England were completely forgotten. So today, if things collapse, it's going to be very different, but it might be the case that we can't simply get more regional, because we rely so much on complex supply chains, on food from different countries, on energy from different countries, and fuels and things like this. It might collapse in a very different way. Okay, so this is the negative stuff. So this is one of the important concepts is critical transitions. And critical transitions are where systems change from one state to another state, and they're very difficult to push back. Is everybody with me? So if we have a look at this picture here, this is the amount of food in some system. And this is the amount of things eating that food. And if we think over here, we've got an underexploited state. Lots of food for the few people that are there. As we get more and more people, we move across this plot, and eventually the state flips. The environment is unable to produce enough food, and the state of the environment gets much worse, and it drops down to here. Now you might think, all we need to do is get fewer people or fewer organisms, and we'd be able to go back up this line. But actually we have to go much further in order to recover the original pristine state. And this is the thing that panics scientists especially, because we may not know where this point is in the future, and we may not know how deep it is to recover. We'll talk about that in a moment, but the best example is something like Arctic sea ice. So Arctic sea ice is this idea of feedback, in that we have lots of white on the surface of the Earth. It reflects the energy away from the surface of the Earth, but as the sea ice contracts, it goes more darker and absorbs more heat and reduces the sea ice even more, and we get a feedback effect. And to bring the sea ice back is very hard. It would be a little bit like this one here. It would be a bit like this, trying to bring the sea ice back. Some scientists think we might be heading for a hothouse Earth, where we have a series of feedbacks which doesn't go catastrophically all the way to Venus. It's not uninhabitable, but it's much harder for humans to live. And so this hothouse Earth might be more similar to something like when the dinosaurs were around. Something much, much hotter, much more energy in the atmosphere, much stronger storms, much more difficult to live and grow food. Okay. But there's a really important critical transition that we can see in society, and that's society acting and changing. And when things happen in society, they also happen very quickly. There's research that suggests that once you get about 3.5% of people out on the streets for any cause, that cause has never failed. So if you have enough activism and you have enough people wanting change, we can see very quick change. Things can flip very quickly. I'll give some examples. Okay, so in the chapters we have, for the book, we've got population, energy, food, climate and the economy, and positive and negative aspects of all of them. How are we doing for time? We're fine? Okay. Everybody with me so far? Any translations or anything? No? Okay. Depressed or optimistic? Pretty depressed at this point, but that's the concept, okay? That's more like the things that we worry about. Now we can have a look at the things that are changing. Okay, so we have seen, this is the pessimistic side of population. So this is the global income distribution, and this is the income growth over the entire planet. This is a really interesting plot called the elephant graph, the big elephant there. And this shows the amount of income growth from 1988 to 2008 across the planet. And so you can see at the lower end, the very poorest people, their incomes have grown. In fact, in this sort of quite low income area, things have grown quite a lot. And here we get up to areas around China. We've seen a massive increase in the income in China. Here, this is the richer countries, the poor people in richer countries. So these people are still rich compared to the rest of the population of the planet, but they're much poorer, they've seen much less growth than other areas. And these are the very richest people in the very richest places, seeing their growth. This, in one graph, explains a lot of the discontentment around the world about the impacts of globalization, because this is almost a perfect period for globalization. The offshoring of lower skilled jobs that people used to have that don't have anymore, and are justifiably upset about the transition over that time. And we can see how things like that are important for politics and thus important for the environment, because it tends to be that the more reactionary governments, Trump in the US, Boris Johnson in the UK, are people who want to do less about the environment. So you can see the complex systems involved. That's the relative change, but this is the growth rate relatively. These people started off with very little. So if we put this on an absolute scale, this has been the change over time. This is how much people have earned more in absolute terms. So that's quite pessimistic, really. Because what it basically says is that only the people at the very top have seen the largest growth in absolute income. So there's stuff that we have to do here, there's things that we have to fix. This is quite astonishing. This is from Kevin Anderson, Professor Kevin Anderson in the UK. This is the percentage of CO2 emissions by world population. Well, actually, this plot is from Thomas Piketty, who you might know from the book Capital, who talks about inequality. This is an extension of their work on CO2, on carbon emissions. This is the poorest 50% here. The poorest 50% of the planet are responsible for 10% of the total emissions. And the richest 10% of the planet are responsible for 50% of the total emissions. So it's completely imbalanced. In fact, it's so imbalanced that if everybody who was in the top 10% of emitters emitted the same amount as the average European, which is about 10 tons of carbon dioxide a year, we would cut our carbon emissions by a third already. And nobody can really say that the average European life is all that bad. So it's basically an inequality problem. So if we are to fix climate change, I think that we need to address inequality too. Where's the hope from this? The hope from this is in the long run, we're actually shrinking in population around the world already. So in a lot of Western nations, we have lower fertility rates, which means that populations are actually shrinking. There are very few places left that are still growing. So we're soon going to see peak human. What does this look like? So this is the amount of time it took to go from 6 children to 3 children per woman. In the UK, it took 95 years to do that. It took 95 years to go from 6 children to 3 children. In Iran, it took 10, much more recently. And as we move into the present, it's taken much quicker time. If we look today, these are the fertility rates over time and how long it takes for each of the fertility rates to come down. Again, the United States took a long time to bring the fertility rates down. And as we come more and more into the present, it gets steeper and steeper. China plummeted. The last places on the planet which are still growing are in sub-Saharan Africa, but they too are declining very quickly. Rwanda dropped from 6.3 children per woman to 3.2 children per woman in the space of 5 years. So all the people worried about population and the fact there's just too many people, well, one question is, well, what do you want to do about that? You know, I would suggest that the most important thing is to give women's autonomy and control over their lives and their family. But the idea of population controls is not going to be a great one. In fact, the issues are more about inequality and about consumption rather than population. Population is almost fixed by now, if you think about it in this way. Okay. Energy. This is the pessimistic energy chapter. If we look at the amount of power of all the different types of renewables around the planet, so we look at tides, ocean currents, geothermal, steam runoff, they're all lower than the amount of fossil fuels we use each and every year. This is modern energy use here for us. The only 2 types of energy that produces more is wind and solar. That's why people talk about wind and solar all the time. That's why it's all solar, 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 wind, 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 because they're the only 2 that really have the total renewable capacity to cope. We can talk about nuclear if you have any questions about that later. So, if we look at the pessimistic side of energy, energy is of course a very geopolitically difficult area. So, if we look at Crimea, for example, there was a lot of thoughts about it being a political decision to annex Crimea, Russia taking over Crimea. If you actually look at it, there's billions of dollars worth of fuels in Crimea. So that was Crimea before, and now this is the sea claimed by Russia, which has got all the fossil fuels in it. And we see the same thing in the South China Sea. So this is the South China Sea, and China, these are all the barrels of oil around the sea. And China, guess what? China thinks that all of that area should be theirs, which is overlapping all of the areas of the oil, because China is desperate for fossil fuels. We also use about 42% of all water that we take out of the ecosystems around Europe in generating electricity. We need water to keep the turbines cool. And so we take out almost half of all water all the way around Europe in order to cool power stations. We just can't do this anymore. The costs, if we factor in subsidies and conflicts, is about 6.5% of GDP of using fossil fuels. Fossil fuels cost us almost, well, yeah, they cost us 6.5% of all GDP. But here's the hope. This is one of the most incredible slides I think I've seen in a very long time. This shows you what year it is until solar or wind, new solar or wind, is cheaper than existing fossil fuels. So it tells you the year in which, for example, you buy the land, put the solar panels up, connect them to the grid, the year when that's cheaper than putting another lump of coal in a power plant. And if we have a look at the different years here, this is 2015 to 2040, already some renewables are cheaper than existing power plants. It doesn't even make sense to keep the power plants running, renewables are so cheap. You just put renewables up everywhere because there's no point in running them anymore. And we're actually already starting to see this around the world. Power plants all the way around the world are shutting down. We were worried about India expanding into coal and putting more and more coal in to fuel their massive growth in the economies. Not anymore. They've mothballed all of them. They said, no, we're not going to do this anymore, and they're going to basically do all the growth through solar now because it's just so cheap. So if we want any hope, it's going to be from the energy transition here. And in the book, I talk about why it's so hopeful. It's because it doesn't just address climate change, of course, and it doesn't just address geopolitics, and it doesn't just address all these other things. It addresses many other problems that we already are starting to realise are affecting us more and more. I've been kind of shocked in the writing of the book. I spent 2 years or so writing the book, and the amount of literature coming out, the amount of studies on the harm from petrol vehicles and diesel vehicles is astonishing to me. It's amazing that we didn't know about it before. But it's another example how it takes us time to change, and it's this time that's the issue, it's how quickly we change. But if we do change, and if we do go to renewables, and we go away from petrol vehicles, we fix things like dementia, lung cancer, brain cancer, depression, suicide, reduced IQs in children, asthma, miscarriage, low birth rates, diabetes, heart attacks. And in my opinion, I don't know about you guys, but like when I start seeing that, I get angry, right? Because we haven't had the options to change away from fossil fuel vehicles. It's not your fault for having a car, it's not my fault that I owned a car, it's that we didn't have the options that the system gave us. But the more we get angry about it and the more we ask for the system to change, the more options we have, and things get cheaper and we actually be able to adopt them very quickly. Alright, in terms of food, well, maybe I should. So, in terms of food, the negative aspects of food. Food is a really interesting one because it's basically grown. The amount of stuff that we've been able to grow has increased over time. So here, this is the average annual yield growth. So this is how much extra per year we're growing in food. So in 1930 to 1950, we had 1.5% growth in yields year per year. Then we had the Green Revolution. This massive explosion is the use of fertilizers and industrial machinery and new varieties of food. More recently, this has been shrinking and shrinking and shrinking. We still grow more food, we still have positive yield growth, but it's going down. And in the future, it's going down even further. Yet we have to feed the last few billion people who are going to be coming along in the next sort of 30 years or so. And so this is really quite scary. If we have a look at this here, this is including genetic modification, and it's excluding climate change. So this is a very low estimate. Okay? So we really have to think hard. This is basically technology is not going to be enough. Any single model that you look at, any single scientific study is never going to be enough to just do technology. And so we need to do three things. We need to reduce our food waste, which is difficult. We do need the technologies that we can put in place, but most importantly, we need to reduce the amount of animal products. Every single model that I've ever seen basically suggests that we have to have large-scale dietary change. And that's going to be difficult. It's going to be difficult for all of us if we're going to do it. But there is lots of optimism there. Because we are already starting to see massive changes in people's diets. So already people, I mean, even if you just go into the supermarkets, you can see different milks, you can see different vegetable products, you can see sort of different replacements. And if you actually look at the data, the amount of people going vegetarian has grown 600% over the last 3 years alone. Okay, that's from a very small base, so that's only from like, you know, a few thousands of people or whatever, but it's growing a lot. It also doesn't mean that we all have to go vegan straight away. It doesn't mean that we all have to change. In fact, it doesn't really matter if half of us cut out half of our food, our meat, when we totally go vegetarian. Basically, it doesn't matter if half of us cut out half of our meat or 25% of us go vegetarian, it does the same thing. So if all of us just do a little bit less, then it already makes a huge deal. I think I will just comment once on climate change. Climate change is clearly the most pessimistic part of the book, and it was really difficult for me to write this. Like, it was quite hard emotionally because of the changes that are already happening. Every year I show my students this, and every year I have to start updating where the lines are. And every year I go higher and higher. Now we're up to 15 parts per million of CO2 in the atmosphere. So this is the CO2 at the time in the atmosphere, and this is way off the chart now, where we're currently at. If you need to show anybody, let's see whether this is the temperature anomaly over time. So this is going back to before the 1900s, and how much the Earth is warming. We can see the plot on the left-hand side there, the colour bar, and this is how much things are warming over time. So already we started to see some warming quite early on in the 1900s. But as we move further and further on to today, we can see more and more temperature anomalies, more and more heating up, until the point now where it's kind of hard for everybody to ignore. And this is where the social feedbacks come in. The social feedbacks, people are changing very quickly, but the question is, are people going to change quickly enough in order to avoid more of this? That's the real question. Okay, there is some hope that we can reduce the emissions, but this is what we would need to do to reduce the emissions in order to avoid 1.5 degrees. So 1.5 degrees temperature increase over the equilibrium. This is how fast things would have to come down in terms of our emissions. We're looking at 10% or so reductions every single year. The amount of change is quite astonishing. So what modelers have assumed is that we will be able to remove emissions in the future. So this is the historical emissions. This is the carbon budget here. This is what we need to do going forwards. Okay? So these are the historical emissions. This is the total budget left. This is all the carbon we have left to emit. You can see we already go too far. So we can come down to net zero around 2050, but we're already too much. So then the assumption that the modelers make is that we can reduce the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. So this is now negative. We take out this of the atmosphere in the future. Is that clear? So we are betting that we can do this technologically. This is probably the biggest thing that we all need to know about that is kind of hidden, is that we need to take this CO2 out of the atmosphere, and we have to do it at such a large scale that it's about 2 to 3 times the size of the entire fossil fuel industry right now. But we've also seen how innovation has changed very quickly. And so things are already changing very, very fast. If we look at the hope of the climate, we can do about 30 to 40% of all the reduction through reforesting, by putting trees up, by allowing land to become wild again, to become natural. and we can actually address biodiversity issues as well, and species loss and the extinctions that we're seeing. This has many impacts with food systems. So one of the things about systems and changing systems is it helps lots of other things out as well. So if we're able to do this, we can also improve how much food we're growing. So agroecological systems, I've seen some of these in Andorra, you can do things together that draw down carbon and produce more food. So that, and to save biodiversity. All the things come together. It's a little bit like energy, where you save people's air pollution, you save geopolitics, you save the subsidies. If you do one thing right, you fix many problems. I will just talk about this last slide and then we'll move on. I think one of the other hopeful parts is that the richest places in the world and the most populous places in the world are also the places that are going to see some of the damage early. And you need that for the feedback. That's a strange thing to say, and it's maybe a little bit awkward to say, but if it was the case where all the areas that didn't feel any damage were the areas that were also causing the problems, there'd be very little incentives to change. But I actually see it as kind of an optimistic thing in a sense, that most of the people and most of the large economies of the world will see some sort of impact. The last point here to talk about is direct air capture. Instead of using trees and instead of using rewilding, we can also directly extract carbon out of the atmosphere using technology. And that's becoming very, very cheap. And if you combine the reduction in the CO2 using technology with renewables, you've got something that's very, very cheap, around $100 per tonne, which, to put in perspective, is already about 6 times lower than 2 years ago. It used to cost about $600 per tonne to draw down. Already, even though it hasn't scaled, even though we haven't produced lots of it, it's already much cheaper than it ever was. So I see a lot of, I see more hope in the rewilding and the reforesting, but I also see hope that if we have to do it, we may be able to do it. But who's going to pay for it? And that's going to be a real question. There's more to talk about, but I think I'll leave it there because I've already talked enough. But we can ask some questions about some of the things you've said.
Well, thank you both for your very quick explanation about a rather complicated situation, I think, on global scale. Any questions? For example, I have one myself. When you came here to Andorra,
yeah.
I was told you came by train. Mm-hmm. Would you like to elaborate on why?
Yeah, so I don't think everybody has to make decisions in the same way. For me, I felt it was just something I couldn't do anymore for my own sense of well-being. It made me feel a certain way to fly. I have flown. It's like Alcoholics Anonymous, I have flown. But it's just something that I just couldn't manage anymore. And again, it's a little bit like the vegetarianism or the cutting down meat. Not everybody has to stop straight away and not do anything ever again. But if we can all make this effort, things add up. And if we tell other people about it, and we tell about our experiences, often that can really change other people. One person on their own, there's always this debate about individuals and about companies, right? Like, what can we do? We can't do anything, and and it's the companies that need to change, and the companies will say, well, you're the one, the individuals are the ones asking for the products, so you guys need to change. It's false. It's a false dichotomy. Both things need to change. So I think if you are talking about the things that you're trying to do to others, scientific research shows that has a big effect on other people's behaviour and the things that other people do, because then things become easier. If you think about the person who eats a lot of meat and found it very difficult to change before because you go into a restaurant and there's no vegetarian options, then you're not going to change. But as people start to move towards vegetarian options, restaurants start offering more, it starts to become more exciting, and people who see those options, even if they're meat eaters, go for them. And that's shown in science, scientific research. You don't need to say, this is not hypothesis or anecdote, this is what happens. So I see a lot of hope in that, changing together.
Very well. Hi ha preguntes a la sala? No esteniu, Sí. Posem el micro.
Igual, ja. Igual, jo crec que en seguretat. with us your knowledge and your research. I really enjoy very much that. You've been a period of time in this small big country, Andorra. Can you share with us some of your thoughts that you might have? I know that it takes a lot of time to make research, but can you share with us which are the positive things and the negative things that you see in this country? The experience, I know, it's limited what you have now, but at least I think it will be very interesting for us that you share your thoughts that I'm sure you have made in the period of time that you have been here.
Sure, yeah, dangerous question. But good question. Yeah, so I mean, I did a little bit of research before coming here, and I think the positives are clearly the electricity system. You have 50% hydro, and 50% comes from France and Spain. No?
No, only 20.
Only 20 hydro. Oh, okay.
Renewable, it's less than 20.
Well, Wikipedia misled me. Okay.
Depends on the year.
It depends on how much water is flowing. Okay. But of course the energy system is bigger than that. And the energy system, electricity in most countries is only about a third of the total energy use. It usually goes about a third electricity, a third transportation, and a third heavy industries. You don't have heavy industries here, so it's probably it's closer to 50-50. But then clearly the other issue here is transportation. And especially when you have the mountains and you have these capping inversions which trap the pollution in the area. And it's difficult for people to change, and it's difficult for governments to put those incentives in. And so I think the more awareness about the damages that causes, I think the more things you will see changing. Because essentially Andorra is, it's a small country. You can do the majority of trips with batteries, and already it's cheaper in a lot of places in the planet. So if you look at China, for example, China has 400,000 electric buses going around, and they're leaving about, I think it's something like 1 million barrels of oil in the ground every day. And it's becoming much cheaper in health costs and in fuel costs. So I would say one big opportunity is electric buses, and that obviously cuts a lot of the pollution out. In terms of some of the other things I've seen, let's think.
Vegetarian.
Yeah, vegetarian.
Positive and negative.
Positive and negative. Well, I think the most negative is the car situation. I think that's something to look at. It's not that the buses don't come. There's plenty of buses and things. It's just the number of cars are quite high. And things like congestion charging does make a difference. I know in some of the areas where you have to go up the valley, the buses can be much worse. So maybe connecting that last sort of line is going to be really important in the future. But in terms of vegetarianism, there's options in the restaurants, and there's options. But I mean, there could be more, but it's better than France, where your option is usually brie or a goat stew salad. So that's good. A difficult question.
The bicycles.
And the bicycles, yeah. I mean, electric bikes. Everybody says that it's very big in Andorra, but with electric bikes, I mean, it's pretty amazing. I know the weather's not great. I know that's a really hard thing to deal with. But if you build, typically, if you build the infrastructure, people come, and people use it more than you think they will. That's pretty much shown worldwide. That if you build that infrastructure, if you build it around multimodal transportation, so you can take a bike somewhere, park it up, and take the bus, people will start doing that, and they have really good options, and it's really safe. People do it, and they get healthier, and you get lower pollution and all the rest of it.
Perhaps the question here would be to separate clearly bike lanes from the rest of the transport.
Yeah, I mean, so basically that's it. If you really want to do bike stuff properly, you have to separate the cars and the bikes, and that's what the Netherlands does so well. It also means that I have a colleague who looks at the amount of pollution that you inhale when you're cycling, and if you don't have separated paths, it's still better to cycle for your health, but you still get quite a lot of pollution if you're right next to the traffic, and it just stops people riding. The other thing you don't want to go down the line of is instituting mandatory helmet laws. You don't want to force people to wear helmets because it's counterintuitive, but it actually makes everybody safer because more people start riding. Go figure. I would always, actually, I would always wear a helmet when I'm road riding, but actually in the Netherlands nobody wears helmets because they see it as just an everyday thing. But I want to emphasise that with electric bikes, they're a game changer. I'm much more excited about electric bikes than I am about and electric buses than I am about electric cars. Just because of the amount of infrastructure it still takes, the amount of materials and all those sorts of things. Whereas electric bikes are just wonderful, in my view.
What about goods transport?
Yeah, so goods transport is going to be difficult because you're going to be receiving a lot of goods from overseas. I'm not an expert in the logistics of how Andorra gets goods in, and this is why countries have to work together. It really is. Recently, for example, the EU have been thinking about, or the European Commission has been thinking about taxing carbon from countries which are not playing by the international rules on climate change. And I think that's one of the major ways to fix this problem of trade. Because in research we call it carbon leakage. Say I put a carbon tax in the European Union, you might get just industries moving overseas. And so what you need to do is then levy taxes as those goods come in. You can only do that in big trading blocks like the European Union. And in answer to the question about the goods, it can only really be done in collaboration with neighbouring countries. I don't see any other way. And that's kind of one of the issues of climate change as a common action problem, is everything we need to do together is because we have these different national interests.
Alguna pergunta més? Algú us volia saber?
I've got this really down-to-earth question about when I go to the supermarket and I see a bunch of bananas coming from Costa Rica, and they're not wrapped in plastic, and then I have these ones coming from the Canary Islands, but they are wrapped. So which one? I mean, and I keep having all these dilemmas every day.
This is it. Okay, so
so it's like, wow, I spend hours in the supermarket.
No, that's a great question. I feel exactly the same way. Because so a lot of my colleagues and us, we research life cycle assessment. So we look at how things are produced and where the emissions are and how what kind of impact things have. And in the UK, for example, your Spanish tomatoes will have lower impacts than growing them in a greenhouse. That's because the environment's just much better for growing tomatoes, and so it takes less energy and to make it. So you're in this difficult situation. That might not be true in the future, by the way, because in the future we might have lots of renewable energy and it might change, right? But it's a complicated world. You can't do anything with it. What do you do with any of this? My way of that, I think, is plastics are an issue, becoming more of an issue, but they're not in the planetary boundaries yet. So if there's anything you can do that, if it's a choice between something that's better for climate change or biodiversity, or something that's better for plastics, I would choose climate and biodiversity every time. Right. And that's my rule of thumb. And the rule of thumb for eating is reduce animal products as much as you can. And as products, I mean, I still find it difficult not to eat eggs myself, but we'll all have things that we don't, not able to do. And just cut those down as much as you want to or can, and find interesting alternatives for. And as you start to buy into all of those other products, more products will become available, and then you'll be able to swap out the rest. Because it goes on with time. Already you're getting nicer sort of vegetarian butters and stuff like that. Vegan butters and things like this. I mean, it's not brilliant, but things change. So, and the other thing I would do is not beat yourself up too much about it. Don't stress about it too much. And if you want to take that stress and put it somewhere different, then marches, active voting, writing to people, those sorts of things are the most important. Take that stress and put it on something else. Just have a relief on that. Yeah.
What about fish?
Yeah, so fish is difficult. Yeah, so fish is difficult. I cut out fish now myself. I have it once every now and then in restaurants. But we fish, certainly trillions of fish every year. I mean, we talk about plastics and fish eating plastics. Well, we actually just take them out and kill them and eat them. And we're talking trillions of fishes every year. So Daniel Pauly, who's a fisheries scientist, said it's like we're declaring war on the ocean. And I think that's kind of true. Not only that, but we use a lot of fossil fuels in the fishing itself. So if you look at a portion of fish, some portions of fish have a similar impact to beef, which is the worst animal you can think of to eat. So my general, so it goes in these stages. My general rule is if you're still eating what you normally eat, cut red meat, then cut the rest of your meat, then cut fish, then cut animal products if you can, and just go in that order as options come up for you. Because I mean, a lot of this stuff's traditional, right? Like for example, I grew up with chicken curries, so it's very difficult for me to go from chicken curries to vegetable curries. But then the fake chicken bits, they got really good now, and they're kind of the same texture, and it brings the idea of my youth back to me. So now I can do that. Like things become available. So I would say if there's the last thing, the meat to cut is chicken, because chicken has much lower impacts than pork, beef, lamb. These are just the rules of Paul. Other people would tell you different things.
Well, I'm sure that's also a nice way to have a bit more healthy.
Yeah. I mean, that's the other thing. We do a lot of research on this, and we look at the results for health and the environment. And we did a paper a couple of years ago that got quite a lot of coverage around the world, and that basically showed that if you eat for the environment, you're generally eating well for your health as well.
I think there were more questions around here. ¿Les preguntas?
Una, però
No,
no la puc fer en anglès. Sí? A veure, primer que la Terra està en canvi des del temps de Pangea, quan era un sol continent, està canviant constantment. I després, si no són masses profetes, que ara els profetes de la nova religió ens han fet por durant molts segles amb el pecat, amb el no sé què, amb el no menjar no sé quantos, i ara estan tots obsessionats amb això, quan el que haurien de fer és canviar la humanitat, el consum, prohibir les grans ciutats, que és la concentració de pol·lució, la manera de produir, en fi, tinc...
So this idea that of sin, so this idea that we've somehow sinned as humans, is that right? So,
que és un tema del pecat que
no. Li pregunto si no són masses profetes, ara la moda és tot el tema del canvi climàtic. La Terra ha canviat tota no sé quants segles o quants milers d'anys, i ara estan en una percepció de
Right. So the climate has always changed. That's absolutely true. We've seen very, very different climates. But when we look at the change, it's over millions and millions of years. And we are changing the climate in the space of 100 years or so. And that 100 years changes everything. If we changed even slower, we might be able to adapt slowly, but we're changing things so quickly that we're already seeing big changes. And if things continue, we're looking at, genuinely, most papers see food shortages around the middle of this century. And, I think there's a thing about climate science where people doubt climate science, but you wouldn't doubt computers or mobile phones, you wouldn't doubt vaccines, you wouldn't doubt a whole bunch of things, and this is basically 99% of all, well actually 100% of all scientists say this is a really, really big issue, and the rate of change, the speed of that change, and the form of that change is astonishing and scary. So it's not about sin, it's not about saying that humans were the worst. There are some people in the environmental movement that are like that, but they tend to be quite fringe. If you actually look at what the mainstream of the environmental movement says, it's not saying that we're all sinners. It's saying that we're stuck in systems that force us into a way of behaving, and there are power imbalances. That means that it's very difficult for us to change for the better in many ways, not just in climate, but in biodiversity, geopolitics, all the other things that I've talked about. Do you need to translate it?
I think the basic idea. Perhaps your curves, your hockey stick curves might be
illustrative.
It's just the sheer amount of stuff that we use. So it's just these curves. It's just the speed of the change.
Sobretot la velocitat del canvi, que cada vegada és més ràpid, i que ara sí que hi ha un consens dins la comunitat científica que ara tenim un problema que no havíem tingut abans.
20 milions d'habitants.
Yeah. Which, as I say, as a population, is already going away. If you take a look and you calculate how much extra impact there will be from the extra people on the planet compared to how much extra people will consume because they're getting richer, the number of people is 20% extra in the impact. The more consumption is about 200 to 300%. So it's about making space in the consumption of what we're consuming and then basically getting over the idea of peak human and then getting out to the other side and having a safe landing if we can.
Més preguntes?
¿Me traduces?
Sí, sí.
Tengo dos preguntas. Voy a empezar por la primera, ¿vale? La primera pregunta es ¿qué es lo que piensas sobre los negacionistas? Sé que son los que opinan que el cambio climático es como una farsa, como una conspiración para que las empresas ganen dinero. Y si la sociedad en este sentido está poco concienciada.
¿Qué es la pregunta?
Sí, la pregunta
Sí, es claro.
¿qué es lo que opinas sobre estos negacionistas? Si los conoces. Y si, bueno, es eso. ¿Qué es lo que opinas?
Són per un poc veïnes.
¿No?
Què opina el Paul Behrens sobre la gent que nega el canvi climàtic, sobre els negacionistes?
Hi ha un people denying climate change.
So, well, something to point out here is the denial movement is heavily funded by existing interests. This has been shown in documentation over and over again. ExxonMobil knew in 1978 exactly what was happening. In fact, they were very concerned about it. And then they had a change in the leadership and they decided not to do anything and they decided to fund a very, very well-funded campaign of misinformation. And so climate denial, you don't get, as I said before, you don't get mobile phone denial, you don't get TV or laptop denial, or you don't get denial of these other things. You get denial of climate because it affects people's power, positions of power and the status quo. And so I feel very sorry for the people who have been lied to. It's not their fault. But we have to face up to the fact that this is a concentrated campaign. And it's nothing new. We saw it with lead petrol. We saw it with smoking. We see it with animal agriculture now starting. It goes on, and we see the same behaviours and the same tactics to try and bring in doubt. It's got to the stage now where it's been tied to tribal affiliations. It's tied to how you feel about the world, whether you're conservative or liberal. This is all what they want us to do, to react as. In fact, it's the case now. This is quite amazing, right? Basically, this is like the monster that the oil companies have built, and they want to stop it now. If you actually look at what's happening in the US, for example, there are a lot of oil companies, they're still doing the greenwashing, they're still saying they're doing things that they're not, but they've stopped funding all of these denial groups. But the denial groups have become so large now that they're the ones working in the White House. So the oil companies now want some change, but the beast that they gave birth to is still there, making the impacts. So it's important to realise this and to not get sucked in, but it's very difficult to reach those people who believe those things.
Sí, funciona, ¿no? Y la segunda pregunta es, ¿qué diferencia hay entre este cambio climático con los demás que han habido durante toda la historia de todas las organizaciones de la Tierra? Porque ha habido varios cambios climáticos es como un ciclo en realidad, solo que a mí me han intentado refutar lo de la idea del cambio climático con esto de que es un ciclo y que es algo natural, que no es algo que nosotros hayamos provocado. Nosotros somos los verdaderos culpables de este cambio.
So perhaps there's another interesting thing to point out here, is that we are changing the climate around 30 times faster than it ever has in recorded history. And the times where it did change very quickly, we have some evidence in the paleogeological record that climate has changed very quickly of a few degrees over a few hundred years. Every time that has happened, we've seen mass extinctions. And so if you want to say climate's changed in the past, it has, and whenever it even remotely approaches this speed, you see animals die out. So there's another answer there. If you're ever in these conversations with people and you want to talk about climate changing, you can talk about that.
Yeah, so you had Sapiens. You already read this book in your bookshelf.
Yeah.
There was a question, Alba, I think?
Yes, thank you. So I have also two questions, but they're bit related. When you talk about Andorra, do I need it? Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay, so
Very well.
when you talk about Andorra, here in Andorra, the last years we built a lot, so the constructions of everything.
Yeah.
And these were built on the valley, where the agricultural land, the few agricultural good land we have, was now used by construction. And so, on your talk, you didn't address so much how the constructions or how the impact of these have really in all the other things related to climate change. And in our case, I think, we don't have food sovereignty, but in Andorra, and with this huge tourism we get every year, it's impossible to grow the food we need to feed all these people. And then the question of goods coming in, it's a big question in Andorra, but at the same time, we didn't preserve the fewer land we have for agriculture. So, relating to construction in one side, how we can manage a better way of growing, and of course renewable energies, but other ways of construction or other materials. And on the other side, regarding food, climate change, I am 35 years old, and I remember when I was at school, we talked about climate change, but we never talked about food and how the food systems made a change or an impact. And the FAO released a consensus paper that they say in 2016 only 4 countries in the world, they really put something about sustainability in their food guidelines. And so we are now into almost 2020, and there is some little changes in some country, but not even the health professionals are talking about those changes so much. So I think, of course, individuals, we need to make a change, but it's confusing when you get to the supermarket. I understand that. At the same time, how the government or the institutions at the same time, they should be stronger on that side.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Taking your second question first, I think that might have been our work, the 4 countries, because we found that only 4 countries had dietary guidelines. Yeah, in the environment and their dietary guidelines. It's another fascinating example of existing industries having an effect. I didn't believe this. So we published this paper about dietary guidelines, and I got phoned up by a New York Times reporter, and he said, "Do you want to say anything about the lobbying in the US on food systems?" And I said, "I don't really know much about that." And I looked into it, and basically time and time again, they stopped environment from becoming part of the national guidelines. So we see the same problems as we see in the oil industry and tobacco and all these other things. How you get around that, I guess, is enough people getting upset, which is a question of awareness, and you have the incumbents getting less market power. So one of the most exciting things I see is how it's become, at least within the system that we have, is that renewable systems and vegetable options are becoming big business, and they're taking over, and they have their own power now to change the discussion. It's still at that tipping point. It's not exponential yet. It's not that exponential change that we need to see, but it is growing fast, and so there is this change. The question about construction. Actually, we had a paper out today that talked about construction in China, and it's astonishing the amount of materials being used. So one province in China has a similar material footprint, the same amount of construction and all the rest of it as Germany. And so you're talking huge amounts of materials. In talking about the local impact here on the soils, there's a lot of people in food systems that are very concerned about this, of course. The soil is there still, I suppose. You can remediate the ground, but not once you've developed it. So the lesson really is that when we make any development, we have to think about the environment now, because it's also infrastructure that lasts a long time. So if you make a mistake and you don't build a cycleway, and there's no room to build a cycleway, or you make a mistake and you build a building and it doesn't have the insulation, the ability to put insulation in it, or the density of it, then you're stuck with it for decades. So the thing is, we need to be on top of this now, and that's a question of regulations again, and having that change as well. It's very complicated. But I think in the case of Andorra, there are obviously zoning regulations and things that can be put in. It sounds like kind of the problem's already there, like it's already been done.
The regulation is not bad, but there is some regulation about, and I think, I'm not an expert, but about how you build and the insulation, and there are new rules about it. But of course we build a lot and we grow fast, and we have grown from the 60s to now very fast.
Right, yeah.
The regulation has gone up quite a bit, and we have a lot of older construction that is not very energy efficient.
Right. Yeah, so I think the other thing to bear in mind here is that urban areas can have lower impacts if you do it well. So they can have lower impacts than the rural areas where you've got your car and you have to drive everywhere and you have to drive to the shops and things. If you do it well, it can have really good beneficial implications.
Further questions? Yeah?
May I just add a point about what you said now? In fact, there are data about what you're saying. Just a few days ago, it was presented here what is the impact that we have in Andorra, because there is very good documentation since 1942 until 2007, I think it was the last time. And they have digitalized all this data, and what they can do, they can compare what is the amount of land that we use for every single thing. And the data are very good, because in fact they do not very much support what you are saying. In the sense that, for example, from 1942 until 2007, and it was done with some pictures, with a plane being digitalized, and I think properly done with methodology, they could see that there is a 10% more of forests in Andorra as they used to. And there was one data that it was extremely interesting. If we look at the amount of population that were living in Andorra, for example, in the middle of the 30s, it was like 3,000, 4,000 people. Nowadays, we are around 77,000. But if we compare the amount of people with the amount of land that we are occupying, it's not the same. Because more people, we are living in the same houses, and the houses, they are growing in height, but not in extension. So, and if we compare for the whole country, in fact, this percentage is very small, because it's a huge land.
Orography, I mean, it's because we've got mountains. I don't think it's,
No,
it's because you can't.
They did account
it
for
has
that.
to do with.
They did account for that.
Oh, right. Okay.
That's the Institute de Studies Andorrans.
This is the thing. So maybe just to finish off that point, there is a hopeful thing in that if you look at this more generally, the extra dollar that we spend is having lower and lower impacts. We are doing things more efficiently, and those technologies are getting adopted quicker. The problem is we're just consuming so much more because we're getting so much richer that we have the bigger impacts.
So true. So, if there are no more questions, yes, there is a question right there at the end. Perhaps a final question, and then we leave it for tonight.
What are the issues about the nuclear energy?
The nuclear?
Yeah,
nuclear energy. The thing about nuclear energy, it's become kind of a cultural thing as well. With some people on one side believing in nuclear and one thing on another side not believing in nuclear. You can believe anything you want, but new nuclear is very expensive. It's very, very expensive. The new nuclear plants in France and in the UK cost about twice as much as new wind. So it's just very, very expensive. Nuclear is also, in the current generation of technologies, nuclear is not a very good balance for renewables because they can't be turned on and off quickly. You don't want to turn a nuclear power station on and off really quickly, and so you can't balance out the renewables. It doesn't mean that we should stop maybe using nuclear that we have. We've already built it, it's low carbon, we should probably continue to use it, we've got a big problem. And it doesn't mean that we should stop research and development into other technologies. But it does seem to suggest to me that nuclear as it is going to find it very difficult to compete against just how cheap batteries and renewables are. And that's sort of my position, is that you don't really need to take a philosophical position because it's just going to get beaten by economics, really. And obviously the difficulties that society has with it too. You know, the waste and living near nuclear power stations too.
Especially as existing power stations get older and older and perhaps more expensive to keep running, to maintain.
Yeah. And it's always worthwhile remembering that I don't take really a philosophical position on nuclear, but I will say that the costs always end up with society cleaning up nuclear and fixing it in one way or another. And that's another. I mean, that's true for fossil fuels too, mines and everything that we do in a dirty way. And the nuclear is another example of that, where the costs are never fully factored into the price. Even though it's twice as expensive as wind, nuclear wouldn't be able to get insured at the private market. So it's the government that always has to say, oh, we'll sort it out if anything goes wrong. I mean, that's another implicit subsidy. So, in theory, nuclear would be great, but in practice, I think it's just not got much of a future for the current technology.
Okay, well, thank you, Paul, for your talk, your explanations, and I'd like to thank everybody here, everybody who has participated, who has been here, sat here, asked questions. Also, I'd like to thank the Ministry of Culture for your program here, who has helped all to come, actually, and last but not least,